I begin, I would like to thank Mr. President for this wonderful opportunity, the honourable members and the proposition speakers for being in attendance tonight. Tonight, I will argue 3 points. The first being that Oxbridge introducing a 7% cap on private school admissions would be a hollow, ineffectual policy, failing to counterbalance the depth of disadvantage faced by students from non-fee paying schools. My second point is that a 7% cap on Oxbridge admissions from private schools fails to account for the nuances of educational inequality. My third point is that the suggestion for a cap on private school admissions indicates the severity of educational inequality in this country, a severity to the extent that cannot be rectified by a simple cap on admissions. Turning my attention to my first point, securing a place at Oxbridge is only the beginning of the challenge. I'm sure this is a realisation that dawned upon most members in this chamber after Freshers' Week. Simply increasing the influx of students from non-fee paying schools and reducing that of students from private schools completely fails to address the additional challenges ex-state school students face. Imbued with cultural capital, confidence, and extensive pre-existing social networks, students from private schools enter Oxbridge endowed with the privilege that merely introducing a cap into the admissions process cannot account for. In comparison, students from state school enter Oxbridge vastly through no fault of our own, unprepared. When I began in Michaelmas last year, I felt as if I'd been sent into battle against an army of Latin-speaking would-be Boris Johnsons, armed only of my training and opportunity at Oxford, constantly plagued by a faint echoing of "Rah, where's my baccy?" in the background. Given the collegiate nature of Oxbridge, with teaching and welfare practices varying vastly across the colleges, it would be impossible to ensure the uniformity of on-course support necessary to arm state school students with the tools to truly excel, as we both so deserve to do and as we have proven ourselves able to do. In essence, simply accepting hordes of state school students into Oxford without providing substantial scaffolding, on-course support, resources to ease transition, a cap would do no more than allow Oxbridge to give the impression of inclusivity and diversity, whilst failing to incite any real changes in educational opportunity. An investigation by the Chairwell conducted in 2020 found that on average between 2015 and 2019, students who went to private school performed better in prelims on average in all subjects apart from physics. As the proposition themselves mentioned, it would be absurd to suggest that the most intelligent students are simply born to rich parents. What this suggests is the attainment gap is due to a deeply unfair game of catch-up that a large majority of state school students have to engage in when they come to this university. Interestingly, by finals the positions are reversed, which suggests this catch-up game is a continuous thing. Introducing a 7% cap on private school admissions would simply exacerbate this problem, not solve it, increasing the demand on already limited support services. Moving on to my second point, a 7% cap on Oxbridge admissions from private schools fails to account for the nuances of educational inequality. The gap of quality in education and educational opportunities cannot be reduced to whether or not a student attended private school. Consider the divisions between the quality of education of non-fee paying schools, like Harris Westminster Sixth Form, where in 2021 they sent 36 students to Oxbridge. And as the proposition themselves mentioned, the same is true of schools like Brampton Manor. Greatly contrasting the richness of education provided at selective non-fee paying schools like the ones I've just mentioned, your average to poor performing state school can typically have no or little history of sending students to Oxbridge with much lower attainment of top grades and rarely any scaffolding in place to help with the admissions process. Using measures like POLAR, which measures the proportion of young people who participate in higher education, the IMD quantile information, which measures relative deprivation across areas in the UK, is a much better measure of the quality of education received than simply whether or not a student attended private school. Consider my own experiences. As a care leaver, only 1% of my fellow care-experienced young people go on to attend Oxbridge. My biological father was only formally educated up to year 7, that's roughly 12 years of age. And my wonderfully intelligent biological mother was prevented from attending university because she had me at age 17. Comparing my educational background to that of the average middle-class, selective state school attending student, it would not be outlandish to claim that their experience is more similar to that of a student attending one of the least competitive private schools. This leads me to another intricacy a 7% cap overlooks. Not all private schools are created equal. This debate often cites the same names. Yes, the educational experience offered at private schools is greater than that of state schools, but it would be myopic not to recognise the disparities in education between Eton, Harrow and your local private school. The cap could plausibly see the 7% dedicated to such students being dominated by those from the most competitive private schools, namely Eton and Harrow, disadvantaging those from your average fee-paying institution. Moreover, this cap would without a doubt disadvantage students on merit-based scholarship to attend a private school. As a reference in relation to my own background, education opportunity goes far beyond what is presented to you on the curriculum and in the classroom. A student on a merit-based scholarship who attends a private school would be at a disadvantage to their classmates who have the backing of years of a family that supports academic vigour and has a history of attending competitive institutions. It seems cruel and rather unusual to implement a policy that would essentially be punishing these students on merit-based scholarships for the very same drive we possess at Oxbridge, the drive to pursue the best education. No, thank you. I call the House to turn their attention to my third argument. The very fact that introducing a 7% cap on admissions from private school is both a reasonable debate proposition and, as the proposition themselves have shown, can be supported by some plausible principles, is indicative of the depth of educational inequality in our country. A depth which absolutely cannot be rectified with the mere introduction of an admissions cap. No, this is absolutely not to exempt Oxbridge of the responsibility to diversify to reach maximum accessibility and inclusivity in admissions. Simply, the very fact that this, at first glance, is plausibly a policy that Oxbridge could introduce, a policy that would be placing the merits, the achievements and the intelligence of students second to the school they attended, shows our education system is in dire straits. It reflects the increasingly accepted position that state schools, relative to private schools, cannot propel the natural talents, abilities and potentials of students in attendance. It is crucial to note this is no fault of state schools, but simply results from an education system that allows for-profit, extortionately expensive, fee-charging schools to coexist with drastically underfunded state schools. This inequality is so severe that the implementation of the cap proposed would not be enough to rectify the damage already inflicted by our education system. At this point, it is necessary that we point our fingers in the direction of the government, call for broad educational reform that improves the quality of education and opportunity that all students receive from the moment they begin their educational journey. The proposition has referenced multiple times the soft skills you need to develop to do well in essays and interviews. The disparities in soft skills will not be rectified by a cap. If we call for broad educational reform, as opposed to purely placing this burden on Oxbridge, we'll be able to imbue students from a young age with the skills so that they can not only enter Oxbridge, but excel in Oxbridge. I agree with the proposition on the principle that the equality in our education system is disastrous. I agree that Oxbridge carries a responsibility to diversify, and I agree that having a more diverse stream of graduates would result in better policy choices made by our government. But I categorically disagree that the way to do this is to impose the cap suggested by the proposition. On that note, to conclude, I implore the House to accept the principle the proposition suggests, but in doing so, you must reject the proposition.